Just a quick, I know most of you in here today, and I know anybody out in the world, but just to let you know who I am. I'm Carrie Gallant, and past president of the CORE board. I've been a director of CORE for, well, probably forever, and
CORE has been
as long as CORE's been around, maybe the first year. So I've been part of that organization, and so delighted that you're all here tonight. And I'm also delighted to welcome Ray Williams, our speaker for this evening. And I'm both delighted and honored to call a colleague and a friend, and to have him come and speak with us tonight. I think you're really going to enjoy the perspective that Ray brings and the what Ray's going to talk about tonight. And I've been lucky enough to participate in a pilot mindfulness program that Ray has been running for us, where we're both colleagues at a local leadership development company called Virtus. And so we're on what, module 4, 5 now?
4,
yeah. And I just had that yesterday morning. So there's been a lot that I've as a result of that. So I think you're really going to enjoy what he's bringing to you tonight about dealing with chaotic workplaces and using mindfulness and how we can think about integrating that into our work as conflict practitioners. A little bit about Ray. Ray has a master executive coach. He's been in the business world for a number of years. Today, doing a little bit of digging, that he's also has a past as a superintendent of schools in Chilliwack. So I didn't know that about you. And Ray's also a prolific writer. If you're on LinkedIn, how you couldn't have seen some of his postings. He's a regular blog to Psychology Today. What's the other big one, Ray?
Financial Post. Financial
Post, yes, thank you. Regularly on psychology, around mindfulness, all kinds of issues around that. He's of LinkedIn, 1% of profiles LinkedIn. So he's been around the block a few times, well known in that area. He's books. I know he's going to talk about a couple of them tonight. I know he's pointing out that Marshall Goldsmith is writing the foreword. So Marshall Goldsmith's Ship World. One that he has out that. Saw the title and I thought, you know, we've probably heard about one of her shows that she's talk about a lot of different pop culture as being Breaking Bad. She is the author of Breaking Bad Habits. So, welcome to Ray. I'll turn the floor over to you, Ray, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's actually great. Old Woody Allen tune. And I kind of learned that early in life. We were actually talking about that earlier. And bring one of the perspectives about mindfulness. I was born in a prisoner of war camp as a prisoner of the Japanese in World War II. My family spent 3 years and 7 months in the camp. And the greatest perspective I had, other than the fact that you learned about survival, because there's a lot of people that didn't survive, and the ones that did suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome for sometimes the rest of their lives. But the one thing we were able to do as part of that, thank goodness for my father and mother, is to live each day as though it was your first day of your life, last day of your life, and don't save it up. There is only today. No other today other than the one you're living in. And one of the problems with modern society we have is that we live in the future. Think about tomorrow, next week. So having said that, I want you to raise like this. Okay? And I want you to think of how are you feeling right now out of 10, be all 10 fingers pointing up. How are you now out of 10? Indicate that with your fingers. Okay, is everybody done? All right. So I was just in the room. Became obvious to me, which is part of my today. I'm not sure. So you went to a thought process. One of the aspects of mindfulness that is absolutely critical that we're missing in our society today is that we inwards to our feelings and emotions. When I said, how are you feeling today? Some of you started to think, and thinking is not feeling. So what we're missing in much of modern society today is that turn inwards with ourselves to actually, how am I feeling today? State. What's the emotional state I'm in, regardless of the kind of work you're doing or where that work is headed. So what I want to talk about today, and hopefully 3 takeaways. And if you have questions, please ask them as I go along here. You don't have to worry about waiting to the end. And if you have a question, you're going to have to come up to the front here, otherwise they won't hear you. Or just tell me and I'll repeat it, okay? So feel free to ask questions as we go along. So 3 things I want to mention today. 1, we are becoming increasingly disconnected in our society from our inner state, because so much of our orientation is to the external world and our external state. What am I going to do? So our always on the doing part of our lives. Do about that conversation with somebody. What am I going to do about that plan? What am I going to do about that objective? What am I going to do about that report? All of that is external to you. And what we're avoiding and what we're missing, which is part of mindfulness, and I want to try and convince you the importance of it. How am I feeling right now about what in the modern world? Self-creating problems. And I'm going to define what autopilot is with an example. You go around doing all the things you have to do in the world without actually thinking about what you're doing. Even though you think you're thinking about what you're not. So that's point number 2. 3 is to argue and hopefully try to convince you somewhat that mindfulness as a strategy, being able to discover the inner world in you, and also a strategy to change the way in which we do leadership and workplace practices, has tremendous value. Physical health, and mental health, and psychological health, and it's very cost effective. And I want to explain to you how that works. Okay, so there's kind of 3 things I want to talk about today. That make sense? Okay, please ask questions as we go along. So I want to talk a bit about where that interest in mindfulness comes from. As Carrie mentioned, I've been in for about 20 years now. I specialize in working with CEOs and senior executives throughout Canada and North America, and sometimes in Europe. And even though that wasn't my first career, I was a high school principal and a superintendent of schools, and left that after about 20 years. So, as you were saying, I'm a lot older actually than I look, and it's not plastic surgery. So, my interest, first of all, is in coaching and working with individuals, and I've become work with these executives that the biggest challenge for them, in my working with them, sometimes for a period of a couple of years, is that inner journey, beginning to know themselves and developing self-awareness and self-management, and traditions of going to seminars, reading books, having discussions I've got, which is that whole area of neuroscience. 95% works right now. We have learned in the last 7 years. Of what we know works, we've learned in the last 7 years. Prior to that, there were some general notions. Now there's specific knowledge about works. Information has not come into the workplace in terms of the way in which we behave and manage people. It's not there yet. So what's happened with respect to mindfulness is the research on neuroscience and the way the brain works happened to correspond to some spiritual practices from the East with respect to mindfulness meditation. And in particular, the work of scientists at the University of Wisconsin, Richie Davidson, who started to study Buddhist monks to understand their brains were different than the ordinary person. And what he found out using MRIs is when they were meditating, the part of their brain that was far more dense and far more developed is associated with two things: greater cognitive focus and a greater capacity for empathy and compassion. Their development was 1,000 to 100,000 times in their brain physically because of their meditation practices. So we started to say, well, I wonder if that could have some application in the population. So then a man named Dr. John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical. So back in 1987, he started working with patients with chronic pain as an alternative to drug therapy to see if it had some kind of success rate. He found a simple process of mindfulness meditation for these particular patients had as good, if not better, recovery rate for his patients with chronic pain and depression than any kind of medication. So there's being 300 place for leaders. So that's the orientation I bring for you. Okay, autopilot. Use an example. In 1998, a French jet, 747, was leaving Brazil, and it crashed in the... I don't know if you ever heard that story. Anyway, so when the aeronautics investigated the issue, they said, why did this happen? Because all the people were... all jets have these automatic pilot systems where everything is automated, etc. But what they found out was that the autopilot system switched off by itself because of problems with ice tubes. Only what a pilot's supposed to do is to check periodically all the automatic systems to see if they're still operating properly. They didn't do that. So what happened was the plane went through a gradual descent until I looked out the window and said, my God, there's the water. And it was too late. So they had psychologists look into the issue. And one of the things they found was that pilots, and this has occurred in other situations as well, they automatically assumed that they knew what they were doing without consciously checking about what they were doing. They relied upon their memories and the machinery determined that everything's okay without actually consciously saying to themselves, I'd better check that autopilot. So what does that mean for the average person, people like you? That you are around the face of this earth on autopilot without thinking about doing 50% of the time. 50% of the time, you are actually not conscious about what you're doing. So how does that take place? Brain science kicks in. And this is why mindfulness is so important. The way it kicks in is day-to-day basis to memory. So when you're a child, you don't have memory. So when you're learning, everything is new. And so you're fully conscious and fully present. As you have an experience, your brain wants to put the experience you've had into a long-term memory. The reason it does that is because your short-term memory, the part of your prefrontal cortex, what's called the executive function, it has a limited capacity with more than a few things at once. Your unconscious mind and long-term memory with millions of things simultaneously. So here's the number. You can probably deal with about 7 maximum complex issues or problems consciously at any given time effectively. You go beyond that, you are killing yourself. So what your brain wants to do is dump it all into long-term memory. So here's the problem with that as you get older. It means that when you encounter a new situation, what does your brain want to do? It wants to relax relapse back into a memory of what you've done before to handle that situation. And it's done automatically without you thinking at lightning speed. Okay. The thoughtful, conscious process, I've never encountered this before, I wonder what I should do, is very, very slow. So the older, the more you walk around, mindlessness happening in our society is it's becoming more and more rampant. Tell me the truth. How many times have you driven somewhere and you just realize, I don't remember the last 6 blocks? You don't have to. It's in memory. You don't have to remember how to ride a bike, how to do anything, because it's all in memory. The child doesn't do that. It remembers the present moment. It's in the short-term memory. So here's the problem, and why mindlessness is much of the work we do, whether it's the kind of work you guys do or anyone else, we rely upon old memories to tell us what to do, and we're not actually consciously thinking of it. Okay? Okay, so what I want to do is give you a handout and go through sections of it to talk about some specific elements of mindfulness. So if somebody could help me with this, that would be great. Oh, give me one card.
Oops.
Thank you.
Throw more.
So while she's doing that, if we were to talk about the workplace in general, what are the most serious problems we now have? Volunteer some thoughts. What are the most serious problems we encounter in the workplace now?
People wasting a lot of, or spending a lot of their time on their personal emails and phone calls.
Okay, she said people wasting a lot of their productive time on personal work and really not accomplishing anything, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What's another problem we have?
Pressure to do more with less.
Pressure to do more than less, which creates
More with
stress.
less.
More with less, yes. Okay.
Blurring of lines between professional and personal spaces.
Blurring of lines between professional and other categories. Okay.
Interruption.
Interruption. Good one. It's another problem we deal with in the workplace.
Mixed priorities.
Mixed priorities. In many cases, too many. Yeah, or conflicting. Okay.
Absentee.
Good one. So let me tell you what I want. So if you could turn to page 2. So this is a kind of a synthesis of that's come out. First of all, the study, people run on autopilot, behave unconsciously at work. They're not actually consciously doing what they're doing. Relying upon what they used to do all the time. 2, multitasking is nonsense. You cannot multitask effectively, and the reason for that is because your cortex, the short memory, that part of your brain cannot handle a whole bunch of things at once. Conscious mind, memory. Stress in the workplace has increased 200% since 1983. 200%. 4, 70% of employees are not engaged in their work. That means only 30% are actually engaged in the work they do day to day. Next one. Between 40 and 50% of workers report being bullied at work. Most places. That number is going up, particularly in the United States. It is a huge, huge problem. Next one. 44% of Canadian workers report suffering mental at work, according to Mercer. Those are the real serious problems that are happening at work, the ones you talked about. And they can be addressed by mindfulness. Ellen Langer at Harvard University just produced an article, but she wrote one of the first books on mindfulness. And she said the biggest single problem of leadership in organizations and also political leadership is the inability to focus their attention on what needs to be done. The brains are losing its capacity to focus attention. They're all over the place. So on the front page, bringing one's complete attention to the present experience on a moment-to-moment, and it increases the quality of compassion, acceptance. That's what mindfulness is. Mindfulness exists in two forms. One form is formal, which is when you engage in meditation. And what I do with all the executives that I work with, it's a requirement for me is you must learn how to meditate on a regular basis. Otherwise, I won't work with you. The other mindfulness is mindfulness, which is on a day basis in everything you pay attention to what you're doing. So, for example, if I was to say to you, how many shades of green are in this room? Did you notice? How many objects in this room were light brown? How many chairs are all the tables? Why didn't you notice all those things? I want an answer.
Wasn't important.
What?
Wasn't important.
Wasn't important. Okay. So what happens is we make a decision what's important and what isn't important. So if you start developing a habit of deciding what's important is not important, the number of things that go on the non-important list start to increase. And the habit of not paying attention to your environment in the present moment becomes things in the situation you're in because you don't bother. So part of informal mindfulness, you start paying attention a lot to ordinary things in life. So for example, with the executives I work with, one of the things I tell them is, I take 10 minutes to brush your teeth away. With a toothbrush going over your teeth, you slide your tongue across your teeth backwards and forwards, up and down, you leave the toothpaste in your mouth for a time. You feel what that's like when you swallow the toothpaste if you have to, spit it out. So you would say, do that. Every time you do that, or if you're washing the floor and you pay attention only to that 2 square floor, what do you normally do when you're brushing your teeth? Right, you're thinking about what you're going to do next. Your brain not to be present. You're training your brain to always, which means you directly in front of you. So extrapolate that to you being in a meeting. And a bunch of people are talking. Now train your brain to not pay attention. You miss some of the things that are not being said. So every time you pay attention to how you brush your teeth, how you clean, how you cut up, how you clean the car, how you walk down the street. Every time you do that in detail in the present moment, you are building the cognitive function in your brain to a much higher degree of mastery. That's why it's important. So that's informal, and that's why that's important. So the next time, give this challenge. The next time you drive somewhere, you do a routine like take a shower. Extra time in the shower, just noticing the feeling of the soap, the bubbles, okay? What that feels like on your skin. Every time you do that, you are training your brain. And we have lost that capacity to do it somehow in our society. Okay? All right, so where did mindfulness come from? There's on page 1 again. It has many origins. It's not just Buddhist thought, by the way. There are many kind of spiritual traditions all over the world that focus on the nature of mindfulness and being present. Okay, I want you to do an assessment. If you flip to page 2, mindfulness self-assessment. See how you do. A minute or two just running through those 10 questions and tick them off if that's what you do. Okay, just spend a couple. Okay, get your pen, tick off. I do that, I do that, I do that, I do that.
Number 10 is
Yeah.
self-author.
Yeah, sorry about that misprinting.
Difficult to practice what?
Self-compassion.
Self-compassion.
Yeah. So the word that's missing in number 10 is compassion. Sorry about that. So I'm being self-compassionate. I made a mistake. It's okay. All right, everybody done? How many people had only one tick? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No 10s. So the average, I've done this several hundred times with people, the average is 7. So those people who scored less than that, you're pretty good. Either that or you're not telling the truth. You're being too kind to yourself.
Passion.
That's right, exactly. So what are the elements of mindfulness? I want you to flip to page 4 on the back. So these are the elements of mindfulness, whether you're practicing mindfulness through meditation or you're practicing formal practices. Number 1, being present. Are you being present in the present, having your mind in the future or the past? Most professionals in the future, the more you miss the actual experience that you're having right now, and in the long term, it will have a final effect to your emotional mental health. I guarantee that. If you're always thinking, and the reason when we think about the time frame that we start developing anxiety and fear about what is not going to happen, what may happen. We're afraid, okay, well, what am I going to say if they do that? What if they don't accept the report? The more you have your mind in the future, the more you generate a state of anxiety and fear in your life. That doesn't mean you don't have plans for the future, you don't have a vision for the future, you don't want to do things. Of course you do. But if your mind's there all the time, you're creating a problem for yourself. Number 2 is paying attention 100% of the time on what you're doing, as opposed to multitasking or letting interruptions. Interruption is like how many meetings I've gone to where people are participating in a meeting and they look down and they're
Doing it.
And they're paying attention. Well, you've got a reason.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, I am actually the person scanning for questions on the Twitter, if anybody's answering, not actually multitasking. And
I was tweeting a link to the article you mentioned.
So, what I try to encourage the executives I work with and work in the management team is to start instituting rules where if you're in a meeting, every devices, no ifs, ands, or buts, including the CEO and whoever's in charge. And if I'm in a meeting with somebody and they don't do that, I get up and leave. Okay? Got a choice. Doing this all the time. Or if you're sitting at your desk and you work on your computer, and the email messages show up on your screen. So where do you think you devote your attention to suddenly? The study shows that when it happens, it takes you 12 to 20 minutes for your brain to come back to what you were focusing on. Times the number of interruptions you get. You've just wasted about 3 to 4 hours a day on these incoming messages. And And we go back to issues of productivity. Time. So paying attention in the present and not relying upon your memory of how you've always seen these things before, or this situation before. I know what this is all about. I know what this kind of guy is like. That's all memory stuff. As opposed to, you know what? It doesn't matter if I've run into this situation before. It doesn't matter if I've met before. I'm going into this situation being open-minded. My life before. And go into that circumstance, that event, as though you believe that. Number 4, non-reactivity. How many of you have met people that can push a button to get you to react? Hands up. You've never met anybody that can push a button, have you?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. You didn't put your hand up.
Sorry.
Surprised if anybody didn't put their okay. So what that is, you've got your primitive reptilian system that moves at lightning speed, that's to something has said or an event or something they've done, and of your brain wants to be activated because it's the defensive part of your brain. That's your ego. That system is incredible. When you meet somebody, how long is it? Time. 3 seconds?
Exactly.
Shorter. It takes 11 seconds for you to pick a person when you meet them for the first time. And you're not even conscious of the fact that you have made that judgment. You're not conscious. Your unconscious mind does that because it starts to make an emotional connection. Oh yeah, I've seen you before. I'm not kidding. I'm just kidding. So the reactivity part. That's why mindfulness is important. The reactivity part of it is when we're in situations where we're triggered by a person or event, that unconscious primitive part of our brain gets activated and it goes into full effect incredibly quickly. Unless we develop mindfulness skills that pulls that back so that you can allow for the rational prefrontal cortex in your head, in your brain, to think, what do I need to do in this situation? And that is a very slow process. So what mindfulness does, it allows you to slow things down. And there's some very specific skills you can acquire to do that. Acceptance. So there's 2 parts of acceptance. We were talking about that the other day. The first part of acceptance is accepting people the way they are, and separating that from the behavior that they exhibit. So character is not behavior. So we may meet and you do something that I find to be disrespectful. That doesn't mean I make the conclusion that you're an idiot or that you're a disrespectful. I just come to the conclusion that on that specific event at this particular time that I view as being disrespectful. But I don't make the conclusion that you are that kind of person, which means I accept who you are. What happens often is in situations accept people the way they are, change them so that they are more like we'll be happy. If you were like me, I'd be a lot happier. We want people to be like us with the behavior that you may not like. The second level of this is much more important, and that's accepting the feelings that you have at a particular time. So what that means is, if you're in a situation feeling angry, you accept the fact that you're having that feeling and you don't try and block it and push it away. One of the worst things you can do with negative emotions that you experience is run away from them. Because when you practice aversion and run away from your negative emotions, you make them stronger. You don't make them weaker. So this is counterintuitive. When you're feeling those negative emotions, what you need to be able to do is and sit with them for a while until that part of your brain starts to calm down. And there's some very specific steps you can take, like labeling the emotion and practicing self-compassion. When you start doing this, you change the way in which you respond to people. 6 is compassion. Practicing compassion and empathy for others and also yourself. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory. It's an important part of mindfulness. And then ways that you'll be happy, but are you hyped up about that? I'm really glad I did that. Boy, it was so important to me, even now. Wait 20 years. Doesn't matter. Those are the elements of mindfulness. And the elements before I move on.
Just maybe an observation,
Yes.
just as kind of mediators and conflict resolution professionals generally. It's interesting listening to the elements of mindfulness, and many of them actually you could probably come up with a really similar list if you were kind of a list of the way of being, way of approaching it, that you need to be in the mediator role. I don't know if others are kind of hearing it the same way. I'm listening thinking a lot of these are skills that you don't have as a beginner, and it's one of the reasons that you can't do a very good job as a mediator. Being present is a really obvious one, but I'm thinking some of the ones that really strike me as connecting with my practice and therefore really of interest to hear how you're talking about it. Openness in particular. Because I think that's one that we struggle with early on because we want to have a pattern of how do we approach things, and every mediation we go into we want to have a checklist of I'm going through these steps rather than being listening and responding differently. And I think that for those of us who've done it for a number of years, the challenge is staying open rather than getting into the schema of this is how I respond when I see those things.
Right.
So it is very fascinating, and it strikes me that when you're talking about finding this place, this way of being in the mindfulness, it's very much to do and find and develop those skills as we become mediators or neutrals in any zone.
Yeah, that's great. If there is
Absolutely.
an intersection, yeah.
Anyway, I just thought it's really interesting. It's really striking me. It's a really strong parallel.
Yeah, and not just the work that you do, but also for people, the leaders in organizations, they'll often go into a situation where somebody will present an idea, and where is their mind? Their mind is on the response before the person's even finished the last word. They're not listening.
Yep.
They're not being open, as opposed to, okay, more about your perspective. Tell me more.
Yes.
And spending the time to do that and reining impulse to, I got the answer for that one. And really works in their disfavor when they have that particular philosophy, as opposed to say, okay, if you turn to page 3, there's a big chart there. Here are examples of what you can do in the workplace if you connected to each of those elements. Some examples of things you could do. Encouraging the practicing of savoring pleasant activity successes in the present moment. Why? Negative experiences like Velcro in your brain. Positive experiences are in your brain. And keep that image. And here's the reason why. Because your brain has a negative focus and a survival instinct, protect you focus. It's going to remember the things that are negative and harmful with crystal clarity. Put it into memory so that it can protect you the next time. That's the way we're hardwired through evolution. So any negative experience you have is going to have a much greater impact on you than a positive experience. So if you have a positive experience, your brain's going to throw that into memory and crystal clarity, and you think in your life. What events in your life in the past can you remember with crystal clarity? It's usually something traumatic that's happened to you. So what you do instead, so that this helps being present, is when you have a positive experience in your life, hang on to it, extend it, savor it, extend the time that you're feeling it. If you think about that being the case in the way you work, that means positive feedback that you provide for a person. Extend the positive feedback. Don't just quickly go over it and then move on. Thanks very much for the one now. Thanks very much. Because we want time.
It's like that feedback sandwich we're often taught about in organizations, to sandwich the bad between two positives, where we don't actually linger on the positive.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
Everybody
almost
just remembers the negative anyway.
It's just a manipulative way, in my opinion. Underpaying it, restricting the process of multitasking. If I was going to recommend one thing to do in offices and workplaces, outlaw and the interruptions that occur at work so that you can address the issue of non-productive. A number of firms doing it, mostly injures to workers on weekends. You're not allowed to do it. Okay? It's against company. So if that's the case, then you're always on 24/7. Constant stimulation. Openness. Some examples of things you could do at openness. Encouraging and training employees to be less judgmental. Well, there's all kinds of training you can put into effect for people to become less judgmental from an emotional point of view, not so much from an intellectual point of view. How can you be less judgmental if they come from different perspectives? Activity. This is probably one of the biggest ones, is train people so that they are responsive to a trigger where their primitive part of the brain kicks into action. So, do you know what your triggers are? What is it in people's brains that will trigger you to have an emotional reaction? Yeah. So what do you do about it? So there's something you can do about it through mindfulness, which is learning how to deal with the trigger. Part of it is the recognition, creating the space, intentional response, particular emotion that you got until it's not on it. There's nothing wrong with emotions, and a lot of people when they're children, emotions are bad. Don't feel that way. Okay? Stop crying. Cheer up now. Which is rampant in our society. You keep telling people to cheer up. Acceptance. Particularly accepting the emotions and feelings that they have. Compassion, we talked about attachment. Those are just some suggestions. So going forward, on page 4, I should say, encourage you to go see that. There are articles on both and the Financial Post on mindfulness you can take a look at. In addition, mindfulness and there's certainly been a great response to it, and the size of the company doesn't seem to matter. It can be taught. It does make a difference, both in terms of health and your satisfaction at work. My book is coming out on mindful leadership and how to deal with chaotic workplaces, and encourage you to do that. I'll give you the link on that once it's done.
Great.
So, open it up to any other questions or comments. Feel free to do that. Yes?
Do you think there's such a thing as...
Mark, can I get you to come up here so
Yeah,
that you're
sure.
heard?
Yeah.
I know that there will be a setup to his question, so.
Really?
That was an open comment, yeah.
Whatever that means. You describe mindfulness and I'm probably misportraying this somewhat, but as being, and the question I tapped away to myself, I wasn't multitasking, but making notes,
Sure.
was do you think there's such a thing as future mindfulness? And what I mean is, at least in my practice, I'm not a dispute professional in the same sense that most in the room are. A lot of what I involves planning to happen in the future, whether it's the evolution of a negotiation or the development of a colleague, development of a practice, and looking as opposed to present looking.
So about that, even though yourself, what can you do
The mind, but I guess the answer is I can immerse myself fully in thinking about what I'm. And it sounds a bit like a duck, but it's what I do. It's if I'm that and fully engaged in it, I'm either talking with a colleague about how we can develop X,
Right.
or I'm sitting in or standing or thinking about multitasking. Sorry, thinking about what my next steps would be to develop this person or this practice or this idea.
encourage you to do, and there's a nuance here, is that all that thinking about what you need to do is great. Nothing wrong with that. But there's really only something you can do about it right now. The only action you can take is right now. Right? So it's deciding what action can I take right now in this moment today about what I'm thinking about the future. And that's where the focus needs to be. What can I do about that right now? Now, you may come up with what I can do about that right now. Think about it. Okay?
Yeah, well,
So that's an action.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking I have to think about the plan, and it is only once I've evolved steps 3, 4, 5, 6 that I can think about
Thinking and say, what actual concrete can I take today towards that? And present in our heads. And what there needs to be is a balance of, yeah, but what can I do about
Because, I mean, obviously, I think that's something many of us do, is actually some of our work is a forward-thinking kind of thing.
And that's
Yeah.
great, but in the
Yeah.
analysis,
Yeah.
you don't live in the future. You live right here.
And I'm thinking that the in the shower relating thing may be more effective than it actually is,
Yeah.
and it may not be as much being mindful and focused on as if you sit down and are actually going to make a plan about it.
So
Yeah.
what you're saying is the flaw in my example isn't thinking about the future, but rather doing it while I'm in the shower.
Right.
It is. It's because you're making it part of something else, as opposed to consciously sitting down and saying, this is what
Yeah.
I'm doing right now, this plan,
Yeah.
and now I'm engaged in this plan. Or actually not. You're letting your mind circulate, and it's not a very focused thing because you're doing other things at the same time.
And your mind's in the future. So, take the shower, focus on that. I'm finished. Over here, sit down and think about this now. That's your question? Other questions, comments? Yes.
And yeah, we'll ask you
Yeah,
to
yeah.
come up too.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. It's just much easier if you're close and we're not repeating.
Yeah, my question is, what are some strategies you've shared with CEOs about multitasking? Because that's a big challenge.
It is a big challenge, and it's becoming increasing a challenge for not just CEOs, but many people. First of all, reduce multitasking with electronic devices. Really start to discipline yourself about turning them off. So that if you're with somebody, are you with them completely present? I don't know if you've ever been in a restaurant, sitting across from each other at the table, and they both are working, and the person's like 2 feet from them, totally oblivious to that person. You're not being present with the person. So part of it would introduce practices where you discourage that kind of behavior taking place. And the reason for discouraging it is what you want to do is you want to increase people's brain capacity to be focused and cognitively present when they're doing. And the more you have that restrict a lot of that messaging, electronic devices in meetings, a colleague. As I said, if somebody sits down with me and talking and they start comments.
Okay. What about the use of an employee motivator?
I'm sorry?
Come up.
She's gotta come up.
Yeah.
I'm losing my voice, so I shouldn't yell.
Yeah.
that we have in various employment situations is the use of competition as an employee motivator. To use competition amongst their employees to motivate them to be productive, to work harder, to be better than the person sitting next to them. And I wonder whether or not that is actually a value in light of the ideas of mindfulness and things like that. Does I guess inspiring or motivating competition amongst colleagues or employees create abuse? Bias, because I don't think it does, but
Yeah.
but
Good,
does it?
Good question, and it's peripheral mindfulness, but I'll address it anyway. I encourage you to take a look at a video by a man named Daniel, who wrote a number of really good books, including Drive, and which is all about motivation. In his studies, he quotes a study by the Federal Reserve of the United States, London School of Economics, and MIT, which looked at the issue of motivation. And of motivation from the perspective of does amongst employees, systems, and financial rewards, is that the best motivator to get people to reach the top performance? All three of those came to this and they said, no, it does not. So Daniel Pink outlines, well, what are the greatest motivators for people wanting to work and be most productive and reach for excellence? Number one, what do you think it is?
Positive interactions with your colleagues.
It's there, but
That'd
it's
be up
not.
there.
It's not. Sorry?
Loyalty.
Loyalty is there, but
Purpose.
purpose. It's the meaning that of the work I'm doing that's meaningful to me. It's the again. You take a look at Simon's work. It's again about the why of why we do things. People don't understand, why am I doing this? They won't be very or for excellence. Okay, number two is intrinsic motivation. People like recognition over financial rewards. Recognition means more to them financial incentives, and yet we still continue to operate our workplaces based on incentives. There's at least half a dozen studies that show that after a person has a big contract, particularly in pro sports, the year following is one of the worst years they have. Financial incentives have a short-term duration in terms of motivation and reward for you. You have to keep escalating it to have the same effect.
Or string out.
Or string out the incentives, but again, they have to be incremental. Otherwise, it won't have the same effect, and it's always short-term. Yet we still continue to operate on the basis of competition, financial rewards as the prime motivators for people. And where we're going to get a real surprise is Generation Y is not motivated by that. Hey, comments? If not, we can wrap it up.
I actually got
You
one
had-
just to put out there.
That I want, at least.
Okay, yeah. When we're, because I was thinking about this yesterday when in our group, and Crystal had mentioned about, and so I've been thinking about that since then. But I was thinking for all of us as conflict resolution practitioners coming from, we're often trying to help the state fraught with conflict, and so I'm thinking about how to help them tap into some of the things you were even just talking about right now in terms of their motivation. Right? We're often and the money's so high, and because and sort of to try and help them get to the place where they're going to get to a satisfactory resolution. So thoughts about or ideas around that.
Yeah, one of the things I recommend for is to start conducting meetings where prior to the meeting is that people go through a process to be mindful state after the meeting. So that means doing a brief meditation, checking in with themselves, saying, how am I feeling right now? What's important to me right now? What are the emotions that are coming up in me right now? where am I feeling that in my body? Because the physical manifestations are always a reflection of your emotion state. And doing that prior to entering into any kind of interchange. That alone has a significant impact on the feeling tone and the kind of energy that takes place once they enter the meeting. A second strategy certainly would be is when they move into a situation is to say, how am I being open in my perspective as opposed to coming in with a set position that I'm going to defend with my ego and everything that's possible. Can you encourage the person to say, okay, you may have a particular point of view or a position you want to bring in. Just back off of that for a little bit to whatever comes up and hold an immediate reactive response to that, finding out more about what that person's trying to represent. Tell me more about that. I want to understand that more. And start training the individual to come into the meeting with that.
I'm just going to, okay, and it's again, just because as I'm hearing you talk about, I'm listening from that place of how do I bring some of this that I have, and where's the crossover, and absolutely kinds of things that we're trying to do are those kinds of places. So it definitely strikes me that some of the you've got your ways to incorporate practices. Those we could probably lift directly and say, how does that a mediation, right? Some of these I could do and try. I guess one of the things I'm looking at, I'm thinking, okay, I want to encourage acceptance, I want to discuss it, and maybe I'd like to have some other tools to do other than the ones in my mediation training. So are there particular resources? You've given us a few here and you've talked about a couple. Are there any that they send us to where we'd be able to grab a couple of exercises, or I'm thinking like training to encourage employees to focus on specific things. Little exercises that might be used in that context, I could see reworking and bringing into a mediation context and using with parties who had a different kind of challenge. Sure. So I'd love resources.
I've certainly got lots of resources there. They're incorporated into the mindfulness I have.
Okay.
Quite frankly, I'm not going to give them away for nothing.
No, fair enough. And I'm not suggesting that.
Yeah.
But there are ideas about where we might look.
There's some very specific things you can do in terms of training. You can encourage more open-mindedness. You can encourage more acceptance, and there's some very specific ways in which you can go about doing it. Definitely.
Okay.
Thoughts? Anything else?
Looking to others.
Yeah, come on up.
So I'm not sure where this is going to go, but you've been kind enough to come here, and if we all are aware for a moment, we are aware that we aren't very engaged with you. That's all. It seems that the distinction we want to look at here is not between, it's about thinking itself and awareness. And to take Sharon's example, because thinking prevents us being aware. I can think about you, and I'm not any different. To relax this thinking process and really be aware of each other. Sharon walking in the room as a mediator stops thinking about what she's trying to accomplish. Just aware of everything that's happening outside.
I think that mindfulness is developing the awareness of where am I right now. Let's slow. I don't need to speed up my thinking.
And let's open this up. So there's it's not me having anything I need to say to you. There's a wall behind you. There's all these people are all around us. Anything really different than us? Illusion in this instantaneous thought. We create all these little separate cells, moment after moment after moment, like little thought factories.
And part of it is because we're so caught up in our memories on how to deal with people. I've seen this kind of person before, so we make those instantaneous decisions, and we get lost as opposed to, hang on, I'm just gonna be aware of my circumstances, the person in front, and just be with them. I don't need to go anywhere.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's good. A good observation. Thank you.
Any other thoughts along these, or anything from you? No, you guys know.
Oh,
Thanks very much. You guys
yeah,
are welcome.
thanks, Bob. Yeah. Looking for others. Relatively short. We're really only a few minutes than we might normally.
I'd rather be short than long.
Yeah, but just if there's anything else people do want to talk to Ray about, are you going to be here for a few minutes? We'll have sort of an individual question or two.
Absolutely.
You guys know that immediately I'm going to start what's coming up, because that's important. We have to take this moment to know what the next things are. I'm going to tell you about the next session. I've actually got the entire year printed out today, but we'll be posting it on the website, so it'll be available if you need to look at it. But we have Arlene Henry coming in next month. She's going to be here March 25th. Her is going to be about children in conflict resolution. So it's not just a lot of her parenting coordinator role, and also working in child protection and bringing children and youth into both of those different contexts. But she's also exploring more broadly about children into a variety of different contexts. She's looking at, in personal injury, when you have an injured child, the way that you can get the voice of the child engaged in conflict resolution generally. April 23rd, we have Colleen Cattell and Howard Nempton coming together, and they're going to talk about how to make the best use of a mediator. So it's an interesting idea. I think they're going to change the title, because I was kind of using that sort of slightly manipulative language because we engaged in a conversation about what did they want to talk about. A lot of people come into mediations and actually thinking of, how do I use the mediator? Like, what do I do to make the best use? How do I use the mediator to trick the other side? Things like that. As mediators and as people who have mediators, they're coming in with a lot of tools to actually make really good use of the mediator, less manipulative means than the title of that particular session. May 26th, we're going to do a session on games. And this actually ties in about, Jacqueline came up and was asking the question about, and this will be a time when we actually really address that head on. We're looking at that games have for a long time been largely competitive, and they're things that actually are building a culture of competitive responses. That we grow up playing Risk. We don't play a variety of games which actually tell us how we might work together as a team, and don't teach. We sometimes get those cooperative games. Many of you probably got them in high school or in elementary school. Cooperative games being fun because they're not actually designed very well. Crazy, so you actually get afraid when people talk about cooperative games if you're anything collaborative. Primarily coming out of Europe, we want to look at some of those and the ways that the way that we learn about gameplay early on can actually shift the way that we approach of disputes, how we arrive in a session and are willing to trust or engage in different types of approaches. That's going to be a fun session. It's going to be a group of us who participated in a game jam and created 2 collaborative games last year. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process of sitting down and making up your own game too, with your own ends in mind. Then we're going to skip the summer. September 29th, we have a weird new idea. Jamie, who's at the back, is a new member of our board and joined the planning committee for this, and we ended up sitting down and coming up with this idea that it'd be really fun if over the summer we had a book, kind of a book club thing, something that we all read that relates to conflict resolution, and that we meet in September and talk about our summer reading. So we're having book club in September. September 29th, Wendy LaCusta is going to be designing that. We'll be hearing about what is it that she's read and discuss after the summer. Great ideas, and I think it's a fun session and really different, but a chance to talk about conflict resolution from a really different perspective. Join us in October and actually lead a wonderful session I've seen slides and I'm excited by the photos. But I know he didn't think that was the best response, but I thought the photos were awesome. But the title's cool too. I'm going to read out. So he wanted to talk about reconciliation and consensus-based decision making, but the cooperative management areas. I'm really quite excited to hear about facility in a particular context, and Tom's going to lead out some of the work he's done and talk about the role in those kinds of contexts. And finally, we've got November. You need it. It'll be there at the end of the year. We can talk more about that later. You a huge long list, but as I say, they'll be up on the website and you'll be able to get all of the information.
October date.
The October date, 27th? Yes, October 27th. Okay. Okay, well, I want to say thank you so much. I'm going to invite we can thank and really appreciate it. And if you're a bit longer, Ray, that'd be great.
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much.